Hello, hello. How is everyone? It's definitely winter, and it's been a week of the new normal. Online meetings, politics, and seemingly endless cooking, and reading, which is the best. But this evening, we're leaving all that behind, and we were going on a real-life magical mystery tour. Flashback 50 years, when a 22-year-old graduate student at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland is tasked with playing host to a 71-year-old writer from Argentina. That student, Jay Parini, is now a writer and professor in Vermont, and he is at St. Andrews to mitigate his chances of being called up to fight another unpopular war, this one in Vietnam. And he's unfamiliar with the visiting writer and his work. The writer from Argentina, Jorge Luis Borges, is in Scotland to work with his translator. He's blind, but adventurous and extremely talkative. So off we go on a rollicking road trip where reality is blurred. As Borges once said, reality is not always probable or likely. It is windy and raining with temperatures in the upper 30s in St. Andrews tonight. So I am toasting Borges with a full-bodied Merlot. What is that everybody else drinking?
I'm drinking a Cosmo.
And I'll stay with the Argentinian wine.
So in conversation with Jay tonight, we have Dr. Rosario Swanson, who specializes in 20th century Latin American literature, women writers, Afro-Latin American writers, and the literature of Equatorial Guinea. Her research and teaching focuses on literature and culture as a form of resistance. She teaches Latin American literature, culture, gender studies, and Spanish language at Emerson College. You can use the Q&A feature on your screen to ask questions or to upvote questions to the writers and to the speakers. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoy the trip.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, Jay. Hi, Sandy and Jerry and everyone who is here today. I will now proceed to introduce Jay Parini, who is our guest speaker tonight. Very excited to have him speak about Borges and Me. Jay Parini is a poet, novelist, and biographer who teaches at Middlebury College. His 6 books of poetry include New and Collected Poems, 1975-2015. He has written 8 novels, including The Damascus Road, Benjamin's Crossing, The Apprentice Lover, The Passages of H.M., and The Last Station. This last book was made into an Academy Award-nominated film starring Helen Mirren and Christopher Plummer. His biographical subjects include John Steinbeck, Robert Frost, William Faulkner, and most recently, Gore Vidal. His nonfiction works include Jesus, The Human Face of God, Why Poetry Matters, Promised Land, 13 Books That Changed America, plus his new genre-defying book, Borges and Me. And that is the subject of our conversation today. So, Jay, could you tell us how did the book come about? And then would you read a little bit of it from
Sure.
your text?
Well, how did this book come about? You know, it was about 3 years ago. I was in southern Italy, and I was on the set of a film that I had written the script for about the life of Gore Vidal. I'd written Gore Vidal's biography, and then some friends in the film industry asked me to adapt it with the director into a film. And so we were shooting this film down on the south coast of Italy, where I was sitting at lunch during a film break in a little cafe. It was really quite beautiful and scenic, unbelievable. And people visit film sets, other writers, directors, actors, and so forth. And an English director, Ross Clark, had just come to visit the set for a few days. And the producer of this film, Andy Patterson, who filmed, he produced Girl with Pearl Earring, The Railway Man, Jackie, and so forth. He was sitting with us. And suddenly I saw Ross pull out Labyrinths, the stories of Borges. And I said, Ross, you read Borges. And he said, do I read Borges? I only read Borges. He's the writer who most matters to me in the world. I just read him and reread him. I don't want to read anybody else. And he said, do you read Borges? I said, yeah, well, let me just tell you something. Almost 50 years ago, when I was a graduate student in Scotland, my mentor and teacher, Alastair Reid, was translating Borges. And Borges came to visit him for a while. And he asked me, because I had a part interest in a car, if I would act as the chauffeur for Borges, and because Alistair didn't drive and so forth. And so I was telling this to and I told a few of the amusing stories about this. And Ross said, "My God, that would make a wonderful film. Let's make the film. I'll direct it. I'll write it with you."
Mhm.
And Andy said, "Oh, good. I'll produce. This is a great film idea. Let's just do it." And I said, well, "Wait a minute. I don't even know if I can remember all of this stuff from 50 years ago. I've been telling these stories to my friends over dinner parties for like 50 years, and the stories keep warping in my head. And let me, when I go home, let me look at my notebooks." And we were just at the end of shooting, so I went back to Vermont. And I took out, I've always kept a journal, and I took out my journal for the spring of 1971, and there were a few pages in there which had some conversations between me and Borges. And I said, oh my God, I think I can, let's just see what I can do. And I started trying to remember, and I said, well, I'll put this in the context of where my life was in the moment. I was running from the Vietnam War, trying not to get drafted. A close friend of mine from high school had just been killed in Vietnam. Another one was soon going to be killed. It was I was in a very frantic state of mind. I was trying to get this idea going for a PhD thesis where I was having almost no luck. I was feeling tremendous chaos in my life. There was some young woman I was very interested in, but she had not the slightest interest in me. I was trying to write poems and they weren't going well. Everything in my life was topsy-turvy at 21, 22, as they tend to be for kids that age. I sympathize as a teacher. And so blind Borges arrived, and Alastair said Borges as a writer. I said, I don't really know his work. And in fact, one of the few passages which had any complete feeling to it was a whole page I'd written where on the road, Borges, I said to Borges, we stopped at a pub, and I said, what do you want to drink, Borges? He said, well, I never drink, ever. I said, well, you're in a pub, but be my guest not to drink. I'll get you water. He said, well, let me try the typical Scottish beer. Why not? So I brought him a pint of export. And he stirred this pint of beer with his finger, and then he licked his finger. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a very long time with him because I'm very OCD and I don't like to hear slurping of people's fingers and stuff and putting their fingers in food and drink. And I said, so, Mr. Borges. He said, no, mister, just call me Borges. I said, okay, so Borges, Alastair tells me you're a writer. He said, did Alastair say that? Alastair's always exaggerating. And I said, so you're not really a writer? He said, oh, I write these little short things, some poems, little short pieces of language, which are, fact, fiction, rarely more than a few pages. I said, well, how many novels have you written? How many novels? He said, I've never written any novels. I said, you never wrote any novels? In my mind, I'm dismissing this old guy. And I said, well, did you never want to write a novel, Borges? He said, dear Jay, my whole life, I dreamed of writing a novel of the Pampas in Argentina, and there would be gauchos, and there would be prostitutes, And there would generations would rise and fall, rise and fall. And there would be matricide and patricide and fratricide. I said, oh my God, what a book. I said, so what happened? He said, well, decades passed, Jay, decades passed. And then one morning, I went to my desk and I wrote a 200-word review of this book, and that satisfied the impulse. So that was what was in my notebook. And so I thought, I remember the whimsy and the madness of talking to Borges and his endless, ongoing, astonishing monologue. And I fashioned this book.
Mhm. And how old was Borges when you drove him in
He
Scotland?
was exactly the age that I am at this very moment. He was 72 and I'm
He,
72. So it's really rather ironic here. But he was a very frail and elderly 72. He was blind and so forth. But he lived to be 86 or something.
Mhm. Wonderful. Would you read from your book, and
Yeah,
then
sure.
I
Read a
can
little
ask
bit.
you.
Well, let me just read from the very ending. When we got back from our second little tour, which I made into one tour, I have my friends. We gathered. We went out. Alastair, my mentor, lived in a little cottage on the beach called the West Sands outside of St. Andrews, Scotland. And it was a beautiful, beautiful wide beach. It was actually used for the filming of Chariots of Fire. So if you've ever seen that great film, it opens with the Olympic runners charging along this wide beach. That's with the West Sands. And Alastair and my friend Jeff and this young woman, Bella, and I went out and Jasper, one of the little sons, the little son of Alastair, and we built a bonfire on the beach. And
Mhm.
so this is what I write. We gathered in a, oh yes, and the idea was, and Borges had come up with this idea. I'd been getting letters from my draft board and I had not opened them. Alistair said, never open them. You're not liable for the draft if you've never read them. And so I never opened them. And I had like 7 or 8 letters. And Alistair and Borges said, bring the letters and we'll burn them in the bonfire. So I brought the letters. Your letters, Alistair said to me, as the time had come. We gathered in a circle around the fire, and I felt strangely, even crazily high now, elated, trembling. Did I want to go ahead with this? Burning the letters. Bella could intuit my hesitation, and she touched me on the elbow, squeezing in reassurance. When I turned to her, her eyes were wide and deep with acceptance, and she smiled. Everyone watched as I dropped the envelopes into the flames, one by one. 7 of them, the mystical number. They turned orange at first, then curled at the edges, brown and black, blistering, curling into themselves. The flakes rose, ashes to ashes at last. Dust to dust, said Jeff. These are blessed transformations, Borges told us. They go on and on. One cannot stop them, the glorious changes. I was such a young man once, so tender. And now you see, Jeff says, a tender old man. And soon only dust, but we come again, you know. You know, Whitman, I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. Alistair chimed in, if you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. To my amazement, Bella continued reciting the poem. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nonetheless. Borges added, completing the stanza, and filter and fiber of your blood. I think I'll stop there, but that gives you a little sense of it.
It sounds beautiful. I wanted to ask you, is it when did you decide? I mean, I know you already wanted to be a writer, right? Because you were
Yeah.
trying to write poems, but your encounter with Borges, did it make you did it set you on course or
Well, I do feel like, and remember, my encounter with Borges was very, very brief, but I felt like it was a continuing encounter with Borges through Alastair, who had inherited Borges and really was a transformation and a version of Borges. So I had Alastair as my close friend for pretty much the last 50 years. He only died a couple of years ago at the age of almost 90. So I always had Alastair with me. And through Alastair, I always had Borges with me. And
with
so I felt like I had the influence of Borges going through my writing career, through my conversations with Alastair. But I do remember driving with Borges. He said to me, I want to see Scotland, and you will be my eyes." And he said, "Describe what you see." And I would say, "Oh, well, on your left, there's the water, and then there's some clouds and some birds, and there's some trees and bushes." And I remember one of the most vivid things I remember is him scolding me, saying, "If you want to be a writer, Jay, you can't talk in such generalities. Give me images and give me specific. All good writing begins with specifics, concrete." And so I said, "Okay, I'll try again." He said, "Try again." I said, "Okay, I see gannets. I see herring gulls. Good, good. I see gorse bush. Great. That's the way to do it." And so I really felt that that was a key lesson. And so the rest of my life there, learning to write poetry and prose, I would always say to myself, be specific, know the particulars of the world, and try to make it all reality come alive on the page.
Mhm. Yeah, that passage that you just read is so vivid. I really appreciate it. And um, because the title of your book is called Borges and Me, it sort of harkens back to that fabulous short story that is
Yeah.
called Borges and I,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And in my interpretation of that short story is about how the text after it's written or by the author sort of acquires a life of its own, right? And that hence Borges says, "I don't recognize myself in Borges," right? That separation between the I and then Borges. Is there a connection between the short story or that, because you
Yeah.
are a writer and such a prolific writer at that, do
Um,
you still recognize yourself in your work, or do
Well, I'm glad you say that. I mean, that's been a profoundly important little story for me, Borges and I. And that's why I called my book as a kind of a joke and homage to that story, Borges and Me, which is sort of ungrammatical. And I thought,
Mhm.
well, people will get the fact that it's not, I won't be pretentious and call it Borges and I. I'll be modest and call it Borges and Me, slightly cracked grammar. And, uh, and also, I mean, Borges, became Borges, the great Latin American author. Uh, every writer, and I would just include myself in this category, when we write a book, when we see our name on the book cover, when we become somebody not ourselves. As soon
Mhm.
as something is published, of course, it's no longer us. The book separates into its own reality. And Borges was very keen on the idea that in breaking through genres, right? That was one of his main things. And also the fact that there's no such thing as originality in some ways, that we're all just endlessly transforming what goes before us, like as in his great story, Don Quixote, author
Mhm.
Pierre Maynard.
Peter Menard.
Yeah, which is one of the
Okay.
great stories he ever wrote. And so I did remember once another bit in my notebook was Borges said to me, "You write poetry?" I said, "Yes." He said, you've been telling me." He said, "Read me one of your poems." And there's almost nothing worse you can tell a young poet than show me one of your poems. But I was terrified, and I leafed through my journal, and I had this love poem to this young woman, and I read it. And I waited and I waited, and Borges said, "Very good, Jay. Good, good, good draft of a poem." He said, "I wrote the same poem once." I said, "Well, you wrote a poem like it." He said, "No, not like it. I wrote the same poem exactly." And I said, "Is that possible?" He said, "Yes," because he said, we're all rewriting each other. And one poem comes out of another. And I said, I don't know where one finds the originals, because everything is a copy of a copy of a copy. That's the way he talked. And it was really
Yeah.
quite profound to listen to that.
Yeah. Yes. There is a short story. My God, it's about this man who dreams of a world and then makes up his man, and at the end goes through the fire and realizes that he himself had been dreamed. That's a story from Borges
Okay.
that I really love. It so
Oh,
reminds me so much. And would you read a little more of your book? So either the beginning or another part?
yes. Well, here we go. One morning on the Scores, which was a street in St. Andrews by the Sea, I ran into my tutor from my undergraduate year there at St. Andrews, a woman of 50 called Miss Wright, whose brisk cheer I had liked. She was Miss Jean Brodie, as portrayed by Maggie Smith in the film, come back from the dead. In her strangulated voice, pushing through gritted teeth with unbearable faux brightness, she said, "Ah, Mr. Parini, what a lovely name. I remember your name. Are you Italian?" "Hello, Miss Wright. Why are you here?" "Where?" "In Scotland." I explained to her that I had come back to St. Andrews as a postgraduate and would remain as long as it took to get a doctorate in the School of English. "Oh dear," she said, "I hear determination in your voice. Never a good thing. But come for tea. We must talk." She meant that I should come at once, so I obliged, skipped down. She gave me slices of Battenberg cake and Earl Grey tea. "Now, Jay, or should I call you Mr. Parini?" "Jay is fine. It's very fine. Is it short for something?" "No, it's just Jay." "In which case, it will have to do." I took another slice of cake. "You were not good at English history, if I remember," she said. "The kings and queens, I never got them straight. You never got them straight. Americans just don't. Too many Georges and Edwards. The business of James confuses everybody." And on like that. Then she says, I say, "What are you doing?" I said, "A research degree, as I said." "I know, but for what reason? One must have a reason for doing things. Otherwise, it's like a windmill beating the air." "I want to write." "Really?" "Poetry, yes. I write poems." "Ah, poetry. Then you must meet Alastair." "Who?" "Alastair Reid. He was a student here after the war, an old friend." And she goes on. So she introduced me. That's how I met Alastair. In my first year back in St. Andrews, I'd been there as an undergraduate for a year. She insisted that I meet Alastair. I met Alastair in a pub, and this tutorial relationship emerged where I would pedal out on my bicycle most afternoons with a poem, and Alastair would have me sit down beside him at a table in the kitchen, and he would, as he put it, correct my poems. And it was amazing. I learned so much to write there as I would watch him crossing out adverbs and then finding stronger verbs. I watched him crossing out adjectives and watching these being absorbed into stronger nouns and so forth, pronouns becoming better nouns. So it was an amazing experience sitting there with Alastair learning to write. And the whole vivid experience of St. Andrews and my time there, with Borges as part of it, came flooding back to me as I wrote this stuff. And I wrote the book very, very quickly, but I'm very happy the way it came out.
Yeah, it sounds beautiful. Would you comment? We have questions beginning, but would you comment before we go to questions and other people's comments on the journey motif? I mean, so this is
Mhm.
the book takes place as a what is it, a drive, as a journey motif, and
Yeah,
your
right.
companions are um, Alastair Reid and Borges.
Yes,
Yes?
yes.
Yeah. And why the
Well,
journey?
I've always loved road novels,
Mm-hmm,
and I was a great fan of Cervantes, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Don Quixote, and everything from Don Quixote to On the Road by Jack Kerouac. I'm very fond of the road novel, and so in some ways I wanted to write, but I wanted to do a road novel here. And I call the book, by the way, the genre question. I call it a novelized memoir. So it's based on real experiences, but wildly transmogrified in the way Borges, I hope, would do so and find amusing, right? It's a transmogrification, a magical transformation of reality. And I wanted to go on this road journey, as in the Quixote, as in Cervantes. You go from, shall we say, the physical journey becomes the metaphysical journey.
Mm-hmm.
And you're tilting at windmills and you're seeing demons and having wild visions. And Borges was a man of, he lived in his head to some degree. And so I wanted to try and get that through the book. So uh, that's what I was trying to do here. And I was constantly aware of the great traditions of the road novels, so many of them going back to Henry Fielding and on and on. I'm very, familiar with the genre, and I love it so much.
Well, sounds wonderful. I can't wait to continue reading the novel with you and your memoir novelized, as you said. I have a question as a professor who teaches at Emerson College.
Yeah. Mhm.
I don't teach creative writing, but Emerson College is known for creative writing. What advice would you give to professors of literature and would-be writers or professors who teach creative writing, since
Yes.
you have such an exemplary career also in that score, yeah, teaching that.
Well, I've been writing and teaching creative writing now pretty much since 1975. So I've had many, many years. Pretty soon I'll be closing in on half a century of teaching in a college and usually teaching creative writing as well as I always teach literature courses too.
Mhm,
And I love both. I always say to my students, my writing never goes well unless my reading is going well.
mhm,
A good writer is first a good reader. And so I think Borges would agree with that sentiment too. And so
yeah.
I'm always, I never teach creative writing in a vacuum. I have students reading poems by Adrienne Rich or Audre Lorde or novels by, uh, Toni Morrison or novels by Cervantes. I'm always having them read things. And I think good writing begins in imitation. And
Mhm,
so I always say, find a poet that you like, find a fiction writer that you like, and imitate their style. And then in the course of imitating the style, you will begin slowly but surely to discern your own voice. And I always say this to students every year, and I've said it for 50 years. Everybody has a distinct voice.
mhm,
Everybody. And it's like your thumbprint. You can't avoid it. Your features of your face. Now, not two faces in the universe are the same. Not two thumbprints in the universe are the same. And neither are two voice prints the same. We all hang words on the clothesline of syntax in a very particular way. And
mhm,
so you discover your voice by learning to feel your way into your own syntax and in your own, and we all have a range of diction. I keep trying to push the boundaries of this, move it out, stretch it a little bit, right? We all have our set ideas. I don't like new ideas come and they're sometimes uncomfortable because they change the contours of our earlier ideas. But this is all the process of writing, and it takes a lot of time. I mean, I've tried to sit at my desk and write 6 days a week really for half a century, and I sit for an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours, depending on how I'm feeling and what I'm working on and my level of energy. But the main point is you've got to keep going to the desk. You've got to be there. You don't try to create inspiration. Inspiration will arrive if you're working, and you just have to keep working. So
mhm.
that's the philosophy of writing that I've tried to convey to my students, and I love my students. I adore teaching. I mean, I'm talking to students now on Zoom half the day, it seems, and reading their poems and stories. And it goes on, whether it's in a classroom or not. My teaching never stops. It's just the way it goes with the teacher. I love teaching.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Are there any particular writers that you are most fond of or that have, besides Borges, influenced you or
Well,
keep?
when I read that passage about Miss Wright, I can hear the echoes of a kind of brisk British fiction from the 1930s and 40s and 50s. I loved Evelyn Waugh, Anthony Powell, um, and some of George Orwell's early writings, and uh, and so I think that kind of writing meant something to me at one point. When I write about nature, I'm always hearing Thoreau in there somewhere. And of course, Robert Frost is a writer. I wrote a biography of Robert Frost and 20 years ago. And I've kept Frost on my bed table for much of my life, and I reread him constantly. And so Frost's voice kind of echoes in my own head all the time, whether I'm writing poetry or prose.
Mhm. And how was it studying with Alastair Reid?
Well, he was, of course, a hugely charismatic and influential figure, poet and essayist himself. And so it was, in my early days, I imitated him. And my earliest poems are almost embarrassingly copies of his poems. And to this day, I feel like my prose, I learned to write poetry and prose by imitating Alastair. And it's weird because people don't know Alastair's work these days. His reputation has hardly survived his death, although it should continue because he's a truly great writer, but he's not one that is widely read. And I hope to really encourage people to read him.
to read him.
A version of his collected poems came out last year, and it's a very beautiful collection.
Okay. And so could you tell us another anecdote about the book, from the book?
Well, for instance, how did I some of these things? How did I blend, say, fact and fiction? When I was driving Borges, he was desperate to go up to Inverness. And it's not like it's crossing the Sahara to go from St. Andrews to Inverness. It's a few hours, 2 hours or 3 hours by car. And so, but we stopped at various places. One place he wanted to see was Scone Palace, which is where Macbeth was crowned. And he loved that, just to go there. So, and it was interesting because there was a labyrinth in a garden behind it.
Mhm.
And so I knew there was a labyrinth there. I'd been there before, and I said, "Oh, I'll take you." He said, "I loved." I knew he was interested in labyrinths. He talked about labyrinths. And by the way, throughout my book, The Journey, I seed it with Borgesian imagery. There are mirrors, libraries, there are doubles, there are riddles, there are labyrinths. Right? It's the Borgesian world that appears in the book. But I remember walking through the labyrinth with Borges, the little hedgerows, and then it's really close to St. Andrews, and a big mist, and someone shouted at us. A woman shouted at us from somewhere, and Borges said, "Ah, it's the Weird Sisters from Shakespeare." And I said, and so that's all I remembered, that there were some woman shouted at us, and he said the Weird Sisters. So I conjured these three old witches in the story and have them come out of the mist and talk to us in riddles. So I had great fun doing that kind of thing. So that tells you a little bit about how the book was composed. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And any other anecdotes about the sort of
Well, I can tell you one more thing.
tales? Yeah.
Another major thing I saw in one of the other things I remember from my journal was a line Borges said to me, um, the greatest book ever written is The 1001 Nights. And Scheherazade is the greatest narrator of all narrators. He said, that's what I encourage people to read over and over. 1001 Nights, 1001 Nights. I said, yes. I said, I've heard of this. I said, tell me, Borges, who wrote 1001 Nights? He said, who wrote it? He said, Jay, I wrote it. I wrote all the classics. And he said, it's really annoyed my contemporaries. Then he roared with laughter. So, and it's again the idea in Pierre Maynard that you're always rewriting the classics. You can't stop it. So it's a really bold challenge to the idea of originality, and you find originality within set structures and classic works and so forth. Yeah, and that was.
Um, it, yeah, thank you for that. It is also what you just said, right? And within the advice that you just gave is that since we're always reading, right?
Yeah.
Or good writers must read. That's basically what Borges was.
I think that's what
was
Borges was
about.
arguing. Borges was primarily a reader. He said that to me. And, he was a walking encyclopedia of literary quotations. And so he was constantly quoting not only Shakespeare and Dante, which he was, but Robert Louis Stevenson, the great Scottish writer. He loved Stevenson. G.K. Chesterton, he adored G.K. Chesterton. Um, so many writers. He quoted at me. He said, one of the greatest poets, Chidiac Tichborne. I said, who? He said, Chidiac Tichborne. He only wrote one poem, an elegy to himself, when he was at the end of the 16th century, when he was about to be beheaded in the Tower of London. And he recited this poem from memory. I think the inspiration of Borges also taught me to memorize poems and passages. And
Mhm.
so frequently when I teach at Middlebury here, I give big lectures often every year in my class in modern poetry. I rarely look at the textbook because the poems are living with me. They're in my head. So I can just recite, Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, Frost, Elizabeth Bishop, um, you know, um, all the poets that I teach.
Yeah, wonderful. And it's so wonderful to hear you talk with such enthusiasm from literature, right? Because we need to.
Well, I think, I think we're in a crisis moment in the culture. Literature has always been at risk, but never more so now. And it's threatened by schools that are not teaching the proper habits of reading. They're not teaching close reading techniques. Um, even the colleges seem to be less focused on literature and more focused on literary theory at times. And I think I think that the culture at large, I mean, has, can there really be a Donald Trump library one day? I mean, really, uh, I fear that it will burn down and both books will be lost. So, the mind boggles. I mean, we're in a very illiterate age and an age when literature is very much put to one side.
Yeah. Would you describe your memoir as uh, fictional, based on reality?
Yeah,
Are
I call it a fictional
stories?
memoir. I say right in the book, I say this is a work of autofiction or a novelized memoir. I'm very, very upfront about what's the genre, but then
Mhm.
that leaves lots of room for play. It's playful. It's a playful book.
It's a
I mean,
playful.
a lot of it's based on facts, and a lot of it is based on, playing with the facts. But I thought it was important to be very, very upfront about what's the nature of the book. So that's why I added this pretty lengthy and detailed afterword, where I talk about the origin of the book and how I came to write it, and I talk about the nature of autofiction, and I kind of lift the hood on the engine and say, there were actually two Borges, two. I was really acting for Alastair as Borges' chauffeur, and I was I drove him one day with Alastair down to Lower Largo to visit the Alexander Selkirk Robinson Crusoe sites. We went down, touched in Edinburgh, and came back to visit the Carnegie Library. But I combined this into one journey in the book, and I explained this in my afterword,
Yeah.
right? So that's how that came about.
Yes. We have some questions in the Q&A. If you, um, we have a question from Ann W. Um, so she has two questions. She says, I am looking forward to, whoops, excuse me. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Um, and I'm curious as to what to expect. Travelogue, memoir, literary literary criticism, all of the above, none of the above.
Well, no, I think all of the above. I think it's full of literary criticism. It's a memoir of a young man trying to learn to write. It's a memoir of an encounter with an incredible, icon of Western literature, Borges. It's in a memoir of an encounter with Alastair Reid, and the mentor relationship is a huge part of it. Um, in the end of the day, I hope the story, and I've had so many, I get emails every single day since the book came out, as sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6 emails a day, people saying they really love the book. And I'm so glad about that. And I guess if you hate the book, you don't write to me. But people, I'm surprised how many are writing to me saying they really loved reading it. And you know, think of it as, don't worry about genre, read it as a story. I mean, I tell the story in the book of Borges told me how he once went into a bookstore in Israel, and he said, where are the novels and where's the nonfiction? And they said, oh, well, we don't make a separation here. We only have narrative, the word in Hebrew, siporet. And so I think of my book as a narrative, and it either takes you along with it, you swept along by the winds of narrative, or it fails. If it doesn't transport you and carry you along, the book has simply failed.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay, the second question from Anne W. Looking back not just on who you were in 1971, but on our culture, how do you account for the fact that you hadn't heard of Borges at the time? I ask someone who's often frustrated by the inattention paid in our country to Latin American literature. I read Labyrinthos in 1966, but I know hardly anyone who even today has read this. It makes me wonder what we're missing. Would you and Rosario care to recommend a couple of great novelists from Argentina today?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And it's an embarrassment to me that I, as a 21, 22-year-old, had not yet heard of Borges. In the world I lived in, a world I moved in, um, he was not really a known writer. Not somebody I would obviously have stumbled upon. I should have, but I didn't. And so he became much more widely known in the mid to later 70s. Okay, that's when his works were more widely translated and published and disseminated.
Mhm.
So it's true that there were some early translations of fictiones and labyrinths just becoming available in English, but they weren't. You wouldn't just walk in any bookstore and find them. And certainly when I was an undergraduate studying literature, I didn't know Latin American literature. The boom, as they called it, hadn't really quite happened yet.
Yeah.
And so later, of course, very soon we'd all be reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez and up to Isabel Allende, we'd be reading Mario Vargas Llosa. We'd be reading, Neruda. There's another poet, by the way, another writer that Alastair was translating, and Alastair took me to dinner with Pablo Neruda in London once, and I spent a couple of days with him, and that was really quite a moving experience. And I've read Neruda for years, and strongly recommend that anyone who should read Neruda and look at Alastair Reid's translations of like Extravagaria. It's a beautiful book of poems by Neruda that Alastair translated.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. So, any recommendations for Argentinian writers?
Oh, you will have better recommendations than I do. I don't
Well,
know.
one of my favorites, it's not current, as current as I would like, is Emmanuel Puig
Oh, yes,
is
please.
one of my most favorites. So,
Absolutely.
Luisa Valenzuela, of course.
Luisa Valenzuela is a wonderful writer.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Luisa Valenzuela and Alejandra Pizarnik.
Yes, those
Um,
are
yes.
wonderful.
And so we have more questions in the Q&A. So lots of them. So Tom Bedell, who is asking, please tell me that with all the time spent at St. Andrews, you played the old course at least once.
Yes, I will confess, I played the old course not once, but many, many times. I did golf quite a lot in high school. And then when I got to St. Andrews, I was very keen. And I did golf until middle aged when my golfing became so bad. And I just simply gave it up because I was getting worse, far worse rather than better. But
Mm,
I have many times golfed on the old course, and I've had pints of beer in the Royal and Ancient Golf Club with members.
with
I
members.
had friends who were members.
Ah, great. So we have another question by Lisa Amand. This is it's difficult to comprehend how a brief encounter turns into a book. Can you illuminate?
It's difficult for me to explain it. I would say that as I describe it in the afterword, I say 100% of this dialogue is invented based on a few pages of notes in my journal. So I would say it's an act of imagination and language. You know, what I had was the physical impression of Borges. I had I sort of in my head for years in dreams would hear him talking to me. I dreamed about Borges endlessly. I was shocked how much I still continue to dream about Borges. And so essentially I was able to just summon this language, this dialogue um, from thin air, more or less. So, and of course, it's in the context of my own life because I'm writing about my own desires. It's as much as me as Borges. And so that's how I was able to do it too, because especially as a 22-year-old, everything refers back to you on some level. And so everything was referring back to me. And that's essentially how I did that. I don't know if it explains it. There's something magical and inexplicable about a book, and you don't even know where it comes from sometimes.
Yeah. Thank you. We have another question from Richard Demure. Jay, did you ever correspond or meet Borges's wife, Maria Kodama? And if so, could you talk a little about her influence on Borges?
Well,
And two questions, another part of the question. You so much older male writers, Borges, Frost, Vidal, Tolstoy, and you became very close to Anthony Quinn. Could you talk a little about why these men of an earlier generation appeal to you so strongly?
okay, well, let me just take that two questions. I never did meet Maria Kodama, Borges's companion and widow. She was a much younger woman
Mhm.
who had been a student of Borges in Argentina. And when Borges's first marriage to Elsa crumbled, right around the time I met him, I realized he was in a state of crisis. Alastair told me that afterward. That's why he was acting a little bit mad and manic. And he was just moving into his relationship with Maria Kodama. I never met Maria Kodama was not with Borges in Scotland at that time. She was waiting for him down in England. He would join her down there. So I never did meet her. But um, I like this question about I've written about these older generation white men like Gore Vidal, Anthony Quinn, the actor, or Tolstoy. These were like father figures to me. I mean, a lot of my writing has been about the search for the father. My own father was as sweet as could be, but he was not literary, and he was very shy, and we had very few intimate conversations. And I think I had a tremendous longing to be to meet a father who would really talk to me. And I also was kind of taken with these charismatic figures. Some of them very, very difficult. I was close friends with Gore Vidal for, my God, 35 years. We talked on the phone every week for 35 years. We traveled together sometimes. I visited him in Italy, certainly every year for many years. Lived over there in southern Italy near him for a half a year once. It's a great question. There were some women too, like recently Anne Stevenson died, and she was a mentor of mine in Scotland, and she was this fabulous poet, and so she was hugely influential on my early writing. And I recently wrote her obituary for The Guardian. She died about 2 months ago. So,
Mm,
and I've just written a poem in her memory.
yeah, there are many, many more questions, Jay. So we have one from Lisa Amand. Is every biography you've written is about someone you interviewed at length?
No, I never met Robert Frost, and I never met John Steinbeck. So no, those were biographies of people I never met. Um, but in both cases, I interviewed lots and lots and lots and lots of people, probably hundreds of people
Yeah.
who knew them. In the case
Mhm.
of the Steinbeck, that was my first sort of formal biography. I was invited by Mrs. Steinbeck to write the book, and she said, "Look, I'll help you. I'll open my address book to you, and I will personally introduce you to people who knew John Steinbeck." And so I really traveled the country, even the world, and interviewed people uh, who knew Steinbeck. And so that's how that book was assembled. The Frost, I wish the hell I had met Robert Frost. That would have been a fabulous thing to have done. But I certainly knew his granddaughter very, very, very well, and his family and friends, many, many friends who knew. So essentially I've lived with Robert Frost since my first teaching job as a kid in my mid 20s was at Dartmouth College. And one of the first things I did there was go into the rare books room because it was near my office. And I said, "Hey, what do you got here?" And man said, "Oh, we've just got the notebooks of Robert Frost." And I said, "Oh, good." So I sat down, I started to read. And I realized that I would write a biography of Frost based on these notebooks and letters, thousands of letters. And so that I began my research on Frost back in the mid 70s. And I didn't finish the book finally until 2000, the year 2000. It took me 25 years to assemble that book, Robert Frost, A Life. And to some degree, I think of it as my best book always.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Thank you. So there is more questions. There is one from Adam Horvath. And were you in touch with Borges again after your time with him in Scotland?
Um, Here's what happened. I sent him a volume of my poems when they came out. My first book of poems I sent to his address, which Alastair gave to me in Argentina. And it disappeared. I never heard from him. And then a couple of years later, a book arrived from a publisher. It said compliments of the author, and it was from Borges. And it said, look on page whatever, 86. And this was a retranslation of some early stories of Borges in which he and the translator had had put a character in one of the stories whose name was Jay Parini. And Borges writes, Jay Parini, the eminent Dartmouth professor and well-known critic, writes this passage about Ginsberg in the New York Review of Books. And then he quotes a very lengthy passage, supposedly from me. And he says, of course, Parini gets everything about Ginsberg, but the true and weighty marrow of the work. And he thought this was hilarious, I suspect. And so many of my colleagues at Dartmouth were saying, oh my God, Borges has turned you into a story. And for years now, people have written to me saying, I've searched in the pages of the New York Review of Books for your piece on Ginsberg, and I never find it. Well, it's because I never wrote it. And so in a sense, Borges turned me into a fictional character before I had the opportunity to return the favor.
What a wonderful anecdote.
Yes.
So we have one more, we have a bunch more, but time is running away from us.
Maybe one more good question
Yes,
here.
what we have, let's say two. I'll have one. So Brian Carso, I've enjoyed reading many of your books, both fiction and biography on literary figures. If you could have some great author from any time show up to your door tomorrow to spend a few days with you as you did with Borges, who would that be?
Well, I think it's going to vary probably every week of my life. I'll be in a different mood and want solace or inspiration from someone a little bit different. I'll tell you, this morning I woke up and went to Emerson's journals and was reading them. And it's funny, only this morning I thought, oh my God, if only Emerson were alive, I would try to turn up at his doorstep and have a conversation with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is in, Thomas Carlyle, the English critic, said Emerson is the aid and abettor of all who would live in the spirit. And I do think he's a remarkable transcendentalist, poet, but mainly essayist and journal keeper.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the last one. Oh my God. Okay, this is the very last question. There is many more. So many more questions, but we just have time for one more. From Jeannie Swain. Do you think that Derrida, the man and the construction have had a negative effect on the fate of literary studies today?
I don't want to sound like some neoconservative here and just rail against literary theory. I wrote an essay, it's in my first book of essays, which is called Some Necessary Angels, came out about 20 years ago. And in the I was the first professor at Middlebury to teach a senior seminar in literary theory. And I taught, Derrida, de Man, I taught, reader response criticism, the works, and I really studied it intensely. For some years, I was writing lots of critical pieces and reviews of literary theorists, and Derrida included. And when I think back, though, I think that the effects have been negative because I think it turned attention too far away from the texts themselves and too far away from what we really do in the classroom is, frankly, a version of close reading. It sounds sacrilegious to say that, but I do close reading, but I hope I bring to it many of the insights of theory. I'm interested in bringing to bear the fruits of post-colonial studies. I'm interested in bearing, and I think in my own reading, in bringing to bear the fruits of readings in feminist authors over the years and and feminist theory. I think we absorb these various new waves of theory. We take them into ourselves, but then we must always allow ourselves to return to the poem itself, right?
Mhm.
And return to the novel, return to the great essay by Emerson, and then read the text itself and then reread. I always tell my students that a classic is a book that cannot be read. It can only be reread.
Mhm.
And so, I find myself at this stage in my life, I hate to say it, engaged mainly in rereading. I'm rereading today. I was rereading, Wallace Stevens and Alexander Pope, and I just reread things that I'm trying to understand better. I've been rereading a lot of Shakespeare lately, and it's Shakespeare is endless. You can never get to the end of it.
Yeah, that's
Well,
true.
thank you, Rosario. I've
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed our
Yes.
conversation, and I've enjoyed the conversations with the questions from all of the people who've been dialing in questions. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Sandy and
Thank both
Jerry.
of you. Yes. And I know it's some wrap up notes here. Um, so if you want to order Jay's book, and I highly recommend it because he didn't even get to the stories about the car breaking down and the substandard bed and breakfast in Scotland that he wound up staying in, which anybody that's been to Scotland knows that you often run across those on the back roads. And with Borges and all those fun stories that are in there, and I know that everybody's going to want to read it. So if you go to bookshop.org, that will um, they're all about indie bookstores, and the money goes to the indie bookstores versus the big box kind of stores. And uh, indie bookstores are what keep the literature alive. And so on March 12th, American researcher and conservationist Jonathan Slate will join us to talk about his book Owls of the Eastern Ice, which is a quest to find and save the world's largest owl, the Blakiston's fish owl, which is almost 2 feet tall and has a wingspan of 6 feet. It was longlisted for the National Book Award, and he takes us to Eastern Russia, where we joined his small team for late night monitoring, mad dashes across thawing rivers, hermits, uh, scientists, and we drink vodka, of course, because it's in Russia, and listen to fireside tales of the Amur tigers. So we hope to see you then, and everybody have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you. Thank you,
Much
Jay.
appreciated. Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Keep safe.
Bye.
Bye.